Welcome to Schockorama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today I've finally decided it's time to start talking about some old school witchery. We'll be diving headfirst into the classics of folk horror, exploring the unholy trinity of films that have been influencing the subgenre since the 70s: Blood on Satan's Claw, Witchfinder General, and The Wicker Man. I'm so excited to finally be talking about these movies because they are such fascinating cultural artifacts. They exist as a microcosm to the greater Western society which they emerged from, responding to contemporary societal anxieties surrounding shifting attitudes towards religion, a growing interest in pagan spirituality accompanied by a rejection of modern post-industrial society, and of course the ever-present and growing awareness of the violent horrors of the Vietnam War. Each of these films in their own way challenged the established power dynamics of Christian patriarchal society. Though it was chronologically the second movie of the Trinity to be released, I'm choosing to start with Blood on Satan's Claw. I decided to cover these movies in what I deem to be ascending quality, with Blood on Satan's Claw being the first and weakest of the three. But let me be clear, I am not saying that this is a bad movie. I highly recommend all three of these movies, and Blood on Satan's Claw is a thoughtfully crafted masterpiece and a wonderful entry point to the folk horror subgenre. However, I think it's structurally a little meandering, and it gets pretty downright silly at the end, which I feel ranks it a little bit lower than Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man. Interestingly, Blood on Satan's Claw is also the only one of the three movies to have explicit supernatural elements. The Wicker Man, which deals pretty heavily with themes of belief, leaves things pretty open-ended by the end of the movie, and Witchfinder General is firmly grounded within the historical reality of early 17th century England. Blood on Satan's Claw, first released in 1971, was originally written as an anthology of folk horror stories, all set within a small rural community in 17th century England. As production began in 1970, screenwriter Robert Wynne Simmons reworked his script, with some contributions from director Piers Haggard, into a single cohesive story. With a budget of £82,000, the film was shot on location in the Chiltern Hills region of southern England, with some scenes shot at Pinewood Studios just outside of London. Production company Tygon Pictures first released the film theatrically in January of 1971 under the title Satan's Skin, though this was changed to The Blood on Satan's Claw for the film's North American debut in April, and this title was kept for the re-release in London in July of that same year. Though it initially underperformed at the box office and received middling reviews, Blood on Satan's Claw would gain a cult following over the next few decades until finally achieving its rightful status as part of the unholy trinity that pioneered the folk horror film genre. And without these three movies, we would not have modern films like The Witch or Midsommar. But what is folk horror? From what I've said so far, you probably have an idea that it has something to do with witches. While this is true, the genre's focus is a bit broader than that. Folk horror is the most overtly anthropological subgenre of horror, focusing intensely on communities, societal norms and hierarchies, and the terrifying power of belief mixed with paranoia. Film writer Kayla Janice breaks down folk horror into two different subcategories, or rather, two different sources of where the horror originates within a particular movie. The first is when the folk traditions of the subject community are protective and may be used to directly combat the evil which originates from without the community. This lends itself very nicely to explicitly supernatural stories. The second approach is when the community itself is the source of the horror. Typically, the protagonist will be an outsider to the community and unfamiliar with their customs, thereby being able to act as an audience surrogate. This certainly works with explicitly supernatural stories, but just as often it is used as a setup for more realistic and grounded horror stories. Both of the next films in the trilogy, Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man, are firmly within Kayla Janice's second category, but Blood on Satan's Claw, as you soon shall see, blends aspects of both categories. In her book, Faith Horror, Cinematic Visions of Satanism, Paganism, and Witchcraft, 1966 to 1978, writer L.M.K. Shepard posits that the faith horror movement of the 70s, of which folk horror is a part, was a natural evolution of narrative themes first explored in Gothic fiction. She writes, quote, "Simply put, the Gothic and the faith horror might be conceived as generic bookends within a trajectory that includes the classical horror text sandwiched in the middle. Indeed, the Gothic was formed in response to an ushering in of modernity, and the focus of this book, Faith Horror, not only shares a similar thematic concern with debates of skeptical rationality and supernatural faith, but was established in response to another cultural paradigmatic shift at the advent of postmodernity." End quote. The Gothic text, arising in the aftermath of the European Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment, positioned itself between the new rationalist movement and old traditional religious values, acknowledging the inherent problems in the latter while remaining skeptical of the efficacy of the former. As Shepard writes, quote, "This literary movement was at once decidedly anti-Catholic, deriding an alliance to a traditional sacramental religion which valued faith, revelation, and supernatural intervention over reason, while equally remaining spiritually grounded. More simply put, the Gothic universe is neither purely rational nor purely irrational, and its existence has a supernal dimension which alone can give it meaning." End quote. As we soon shall see, folk horror films have a tendency to similarly position themselves between old pre-Christian paganist ideals and modern concepts of rationality and post-Reformation Christianity. Before discussing the film itself, it will be helpful to talk about the two men most responsible for guiding its creation: director Piers Haggard and screenwriter Robert Wynne Simmons. Robert Wynne Simmons discovered his writing abilities at a young age as a form of therapy to deal with his vivid nightmares and bullying he suffered while at school, which contributed to what he describes as a sort of mental breakdown when he was just 12 years old. He continued to pour much of his energy into writing while studying at Cambridge University, during which time he unfortunately spent a lot of his time in the hospital due to some life-threatening medical conditions, but was still ultimately able to complete his degree. After getting several short stories published and participating in a couple low-budget film productions, Wynne Simmons was approached by Chilton Films, a production company that seems unfortunately to no longer exist, to create a script for a horror movie. Robert Wynne Simmons pulled from his previously published short story collection, Legends of Torment of Body and Soul, and from an idea that he'd had in his head for a while about modern churches being built on top of ancient pagan ritual sites. And he ended up with an anthology of 3 short stories all set in the same rural English village, after one of the locals digs up some disturbingly demonic-looking remains in a field. From an interview with Robert Wynne Simmons, it sounds like it was Chilton Films who had been pushing for the film to be an anthology, despite the fact that Wynne Simmons had wanted all along for it to be a single story. However, as pre-production progressed, it became increasingly clear that it would be easier and more cost-effective to shoot the film as a single story, so Wynne Simmons got what he wanted in the end. Piers Haggard had mainly worked as a director for television series up to this point, though I did notice he'd worked as a dialogue assistant for the 1966 Michelangelo Antonioni film Blow Up, which is itself a very interesting thriller, and I think may have been somewhat influential to the Italian Giallo movement. But I have to stop myself there, otherwise I will derail this entire video, and that's a threat. When it came time to begin casting the movie, the studio originally sought out either Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing to play the role of the judge. But both of these legendary British actors, by now household names thanks to their numerous memorable roles in Hammer horror films, were simply too expensive for the studio to hire. Piers Haggard happened to know an actor by the name of Patrick Wymark, who turned out to be perfect for the role of the judge. Patrick Wymark had also appeared in another of the Unholy Trinity films, appearing alongside alongside Vincent Price in Witchfinder General just a few years earlier. Unfortunately, Blood on Satan's Claw would be Patrick Wymark's last film appearance, as he passed away on October 20th, 1970, at just 44 years old, only a handful of months before Blood on Satan's Claw saw its theatrical release. So now, in honor of Patrick Wymark's memory, let's take a look at this bewitching tale of terror and see what devilish facts we can dig up along the way. The film begins, intentionally, with a low-angle shot of a plow tilling a field in rural England. In an interview for the absolutely fantastic documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror, Piers Haggard discusses his intention behind some of these low-angle shots, saying, quote, "It's supposed to suggest whatever is coming from below," end quote. And we get a glimpse of what is coming when Ralph Gower, the field hand with the plow, uncovers a monstrous face with an eye straight out of my nightmares. After an opening credits sequence played over some aesthetically pleasing shots of birds and tangled branches, Ralph rushes to the house of the landowner, Mistress Banham, who is currently hosting an old friend referred to only as the Judge, a wealthy and powerful man visiting from London. The Judge initially laughs off Ralph's fantastical story, attributing it to simple country superstition.
You see, my dear Isabel, the way these old superstitions die hard.
But Mistress Banham is frightened by the story and convinces the Judge to go and have a look at the face, if only to put her mind at ease. As Ralph leads the Judge out to the field, they see that the young master of the house, Peter, has returned with his fiancée, Rosalind. Much to Mistress Banham's dismay, Rosalind is of a lower class than them, being a farmer's daughter.
You intend to marry my nephew, is that it?
Her disdain for Rosalind is not shared by everyone, though, as many of the young field hands and workers are excited to hear the story of how Peter and Rosalind escaped from Rosalind's window in the dead of night. Particularly, one girl named Kathy Vespers is quite caught up in the romance of it all, and daydreams of when her crush, Ralph Gower, will ask her to marry him. Don't worry too much about keeping up with all of these romances, as the filmmakers mostly use it as a tool to just flesh out a couple of the more important characters, since Kathy Vespers and Ralph Gower especially will be playing a more important role later in the plot. Also, I don't know where else to say this, so I'm just going to tell y'all right here. Peter is Mistress Banham's nephew, and his actual parents are never mentioned or referred to. This is mostly irrelevant to the plot, but I also felt like it would just be really weird if I never explained Mistress Banham and Peter's relationship to each other. Ralph and the Judge make their way out to the field, where the demonic remains have mysteriously vanished, and we get this iconic line reading from Patrick Wymark.
Human remains. No, sir, a sort of head, a face. Of a fiend.
It's definitely the kind of clip you'd play during the intro to the heaviest doom metal song you have ever heard.
Human remains. No, sir, a sort of head, a face. Of a fiend.
Though they couldn't find any evidence of demonic activity, they do find the local Reverend Fallowfield catching snakes in the underbrush nearby. Reverend Fallowfield is a bit of a strange person, but in that local character kind of way. He teaches scripture to all of the village children, and as we see here, in his free time he likes to study wildlife. There's definitely some religious symbolism here to him specifically catching a snake in this scene, only a couple meters from where demonic remains had just been uncovered. That night, the Judge, Mistress Banham, Peter, and Peter's fiancée Rosalind all play a card game which the Judge wins, prompting some very rude comments about Rosalind's fitness to be Peter's wife out of Mistress Banham.
No doubt in other respects she will do better.
Hope you will all excuse me if I retire.
Rosalind is understandably very upset by this, but when she tries to retire for the night, the judge remarks how improper it is for her to be sleeping under the same roof as her betrothed. Peter doubles down, insisting that Rosalind be allowed to stay here for the night since she cannot return to her home. Mistress Banham decides to put Rosalind up in the attic room, which no one's used for at least 5 years. Peter and Rosalind's relationship and the tension it creates between them and Mistress Banham and the judge is definitely a stand-in to represent the shifting of attitudes towards traditional relationships and premarital sex that was happening in the 20th century. Something interesting about these kinds of folk horror movies with explicit supernatural elements is the question of how to interpret the themes of the youth turning their backs on traditional social structures. Are the filmmakers trying to say this is a good or bad thing? The behaviors of the youth within this film are almost inextricably linked with the destructive forces of witchcraft and satanic ritual. On the surface, if one accepts the quote-unquote natural order of things as being Christian, then this turn to the satanic is undebatably evil and disturbing. However, Blood on Satan's Claw does not set up its main conflict as being between Christianity and witchcraft. Instead, the conflict is set up as being between witchcraft and the rationalism of the Enlightenment. To immediately underline this point, downstairs, Peter and the judge are having a quiet late-night conversation where the judge is offering his advice on Peter's imminent marriage, to beware the wiles of women.
Beware the wiles of women.
Reveals that he himself had once been a suitor to Peter's aunt, Mistress Banham, and then ends it all with an ironic toast to the Catholic King James III, wishing that God bless him and keep him in exile, before throwing his cup over his shoulder. In his essay on the film, Witchcraft and the Enlightenment in Blood on Satan's Claw, published on the website Horror Homeroom, Michael Curliano writes, quote, "This is not the more familiar world of Hammer horror, with its Victorian Gothic milieu of occult revivalism, but rather the era of peak disenchantment, where old beliefs, like old regimes, are worth little more than a brief ceremonial acknowledgement before being chucked aside." End quote. Returning to the movie, Rosalind's night in the attic is troubled by disturbing shadows and terrifying noises, until she starts screaming uncontrollably, waking up everyone in the house. Mistress Banham takes charge, entering Rosalind's room to console her with the time-honored tradition of slapping a screaming woman in the face until she stops. The judge, feeling that he should be doing something as well, decides to give Peter a solid smack for good measure.
Jesus! Read about Jehovah's Witness? How about Buddhism?
Unfortunately for Mistress Banham, Rosalind fights back, seriously scratching up the lady's face. The judge yells for Mistress Banham's maid to fetch Ralph Gower to board up Rosalind's door so she can't hurt anyone else until they can have someone come take her away to be institutionalized. Poor Peter is heartbroken and deep in denial about what has just happened to his wife-to-be, and the judge tries to comfort him.
The madhouse!
Judge yourself fortunate, young man. She could never have been the fit wife for you.
Listen, I get what the judge is saying, I just think he really needs to work on his timing. Mistress Banham comes down with a fever due to her injuries, and the doctor is hilariously unhelpful. He makes vague comments about how many mysterious illnesses people have been getting lately, and when Mistress Banham asks him what's wrong with her, he cheerfully says he has no idea, but he's gonna open a vein and let her bleed it out. For those of you who don't know, this was an actual medical practice known as bloodletting, which originated over 2,000 years ago. Archaeological discoveries have suggested that it was common practice in ancient Egypt, and records indicate that it was used in ancient Greece in the 5th century BCE, during the lifetime of the ancient Greek philosopher and physician Hippocrates. As anyone who's been to a doctor recently would know, bloodletting has been widely discredited by modern medicine, but the practice continued for a surprisingly long time, only falling out of favor in Europe in the late 19th century. Meanwhile, we see some local children running through the field where Ralph Gower had previously dug up that demonic face. Kathy Vespers, who we saw earlier talking excitedly with Peter and Rosalind upon their arrival, is walking with her brother, Mark, and another local girl named Angel Blake. While Kathy tells them that she'd heard screaming that night, most likely from the demonic happenings at Mistress Banham's house, Angel Blake bends down and picks something up that she won't let the other two see. Back at the house, the men from the sanitarium have arrived to take Rosalind away. There's certainly something different about her demeanor as she's led down the stairs, and I'm not totally sure that the demonic claw that's replaced her hand goes with that nightgown. But then again, what do I know about 17th century rural English fashion? Unfortunately for the remaining members of the household, the excitement is far from over. Almost as soon as the carriage pulls away with poor Rosalind, the judge hears the maid calling frantically for Mistress Banham. The mistress of the house, who, need I remind you, was as of a minute ago bedridden with bandages covering most of her face, has now vanished without a trace. Nearby, at the village church, Reverend Fallowfield is trying to teach his catechism class, but constant disruptions are making this difficult. The source of these disruptions is Angel Blake, who is showing her classmates what she'd found in the field earlier. We finally get to see that it's an animal-like claw, identical to the claws that we saw growing out of Rosalind's hand when she was being taken away to the asylum. We also see a bit of Angel's defiant personality. She's got some scary eyes. Meanwhile, the hunt for Mistress Banham has turned up nothing, much to the consternation of the judge and Squire Middleton, a local wealthy landowner. Though in medieval times a squire was typically a young boy who worked as an attendant to a knight, by the 1600s, when this movie is set, the term squire more commonly referred to a gentleman landowner in a rural area, typically holding some political power in the area where they lived. At the risk of saying something completely wrong, I believe a modern equivalent could be the mayor or a councilman for a small town or village. But for this video, all you need to know is that Squire Middleton is a wealthy landowner with a bit of political power in the area. And because I had to look up the history of the term squire, I am now forcing you all to learn about it with me. Squire Middleton is the first character in the movie to suggest the presence of witchcraft in the village, though the judge doesn't take such suggestions seriously.
Unless it were witchcraft. There have been some cases.
Witchcraft.
But Peter is still convinced that something supernatural happened to Rosalind in the attic room. So that night he decides to sneak upstairs to the attic room to spend the night there so he can figure out exactly what's been haunting them. To his horror, his candle is blown out and he begins hearing strange noises coming from under the floorboards. And to my horror, when one of the floorboards pops open, he decides to just plop his whole arm in there. Just shoves it all the way down to the shoulder. No hesitation and no survival instincts. He begins freaking out when something starts pulling him into the floor, which I could have told you would happen, you dummy. We catch a glimpse of the hairy claw that's pulling him in, further confirming the disturbing vision of Rosalind's claw hand from earlier. Peter covers the hole in the floor with a heavy chest, but is woken up again when a clawed hand begins strangling him in bed. He grabs a knife and starts viciously stabbing at the clawed arm, only stopping when the judge bursts into the room to find that Peter has cut his own hand off. Later in the day, once the doctor has arrived and bandaged up Peter's arm, he shows the judge a book he has with some woodcuts of demonic visions, including a face that closely resembles the demonic remains that Ralph Gower found in the field at the very beginning of this movie. The judge seems to finally be rethinking his stance on witchcraft and the occult in his rational and enlightened world, and asks the doctor to loan him the book for a bit. I noticed that the print of the demonic face was labeled as being a vision of Saint Amand, so you better know I had to look that up. Saint Amand is indeed a real saint who lived in France in the 6th and 7th centuries. He is the patron saint of beer brewers, winemakers, and merchants, and became a saint by performing the miracle of reanimating a man after he had been hanged. I couldn't find much info about this, but he apparently also had a vision of a serpent and performed another miracle once where he subdued a snake through the power of prayer. This doesn't seem to have that much to do with blood on Satan's claw, but now you know a bit more about 7th century French saints than you did before you started watching this video. The judge prepares to depart to London on important business, and we learn that the hunt for Mistress Banham has officially been called off, as it has now been several days with no sign of her. Peter's condition is stable, and he is expected to make a full recovery, minus one hand, of course. Before the judge departs in his carriage, he gives Squire Middleton and Ralph Gower an ominous warning.
But you must have patience. Even while people die, only thus can the whole evil be destroyed. You must let it grow.
That is definitely not comforting to hear. Soon after the judge's departure, we see Kathy Vespers walking through the woods with her brother Mark. Mark is complaining about a pain in his side, which started when he was hanging out with Angel Blake and holding the mysterious claw she'd found. Kathy encourages him to recite the Lord's Prayer as they walk home together. This is a reference to real-life beliefs from the time period that one who'd fallen under the devil's control would be unable to recite the Lord's Prayer. This belief was unfortunately weaponized against the many accused victims of the Salem witch trials. And I didn't realize until recently, when listening to the series that Last Podcast on the Left recorded about it, how ridiculously specific this rule about the Lord's Prayer was. The belief was not that the accused witch would choke up and be physically unable to speak, but rather that they would simply mix up a word or two during the recitation. This made it especially dangerous as there are a couple common versions of the Lord's Prayer, even within the same Bible. According to Wikipedia, which cites the New International Version of the Bible, in the book of Matthew, the prayer is written as this: "Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors." However, within this same version of the Bible, in the book of Luke, this same prayer is written as, "Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us." Though this version of the Bible didn't exist until the 1970s, it still gives you an idea of how easy it could be to recite a wrong version of this prayer. Also, my wife Athena was raised Greek Orthodox, and she says that the version of this prayer that she grew up with has, quote, "too many syllables and no flow," end quote. So here she is reciting it.
The Lord's Prayer? You mean, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. No flow, too wordy, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I just feel like they chose the worst words to deliver the message.
Honestly, this doesn't even really come into play in this movie, but I've just been researching and digesting so much information about historical witch hunts for this video series, and I'm not always going to find appropriate places to info dump about it, so consider yourself learned, idiot. Back at their house, Kathy and Mark's mom insists on going to see the doctor to get some medicine for Mark, despite his protests that there's nothing wrong with him. Kathy goes off to scripture class, and their mom goes out to see the doctor, leaving Mark home alone to play with some bones he had in his pocket. And the way he throws them on the table seems to suggest that they are meant for divination, in this case a form of divination known as osteomancy. Mark has clearly been playing with witchcraft, and it doesn't seem to be responding well with his body, as the pain in his side immediately comes back right after he throws the bones. We also see two creepy kids spying on him through the window. They do a pretty good imitation of the ghost twins from The Shining, which is doubly impressive since this movie came out about a decade before The Shining movie came out, and about 6 years before the novel was published. Ultimately, these two girls do manage to convince Mark to come with them, saying that Angel wants to see him. Reverend Fallowfield is disturbed to find that only half of his class has shown up today. He berates the few students that did show up for their insolent ungodliness, but come on, dude. These are your good students. It's not their fault that their classmates decided to ditch class to go summon demons out in the woods. Speaking of which, we see Mark in the abandoned ruins of an old church out in the woods, playing a game of blindfolded tag with a large group of children from the village. I love the way this sequence is shot, starting out joyfully with lots of giggles from all of the children, but we keep seeing Angel Blake standing through a doorway in the background, and the music gradually starts getting creepy with these droning violins as Mark is slowly led to the room where Angel is standing. It's so unsettling, and it really does a good job of building up this feeling of dread through the juxtaposition of the energetic playfulness of the children and the terrifying stillness of Angel Blake, who has clearly become a sort of leader for them. Unfortunately, our fears are realized as Angel slips a noose of vines around Mark's neck and chokes him while the other children watch. The children still aren't done tormenting people, though. As Mark's mother walks home through the forest with a vial of medicine in her hand, a boy throws a rock, shattering the vial. When Mark's mother begins berating the boy, he tells her cryptically that Mark won't be needing the medicine anymore and that they've closed him into the woodshed, after which he runs back off into the forest.
Mark won't need it no more.
What does that mean, boy?
we shot him in the woodshed.
Mark's mother rushes back to the house and into their woodshed, which is eerily quiet. She calls for Mark a few times until she notices an odd shape under a pile of firewood. As she hysterically begins pulling the wood down, we see the bloodied remains of Mark buried underneath. Considering what literally just happened, this next statement might sound a bit ridiculous, but we are about to see one of the most disturbing scenes in the film. That night, as Reverend Fallowfield does some writing work and feeds a very cute little bunny, Angel Blake shows up at the church. The Reverend immediately gets up and begins scolding Angel for her disruptive behavior during class, and more recently, her failure to even show up to class. And as he does so, Angel begins removing her clothes, until she is standing completely naked in front of the Reverend. Apart from the very disturbing nature of the scene itself, with a young girl attempting to seduce her adult teacher, the scene is doubly disturbing because at the time it was shot in 1970, actress Linda Hayden, who plays Angel Blake, was only 17 years old. For a number of reasons that should be very obvious to you now, I will not be showing any of this scene, but all you need to know for the story is that Angel attempts to seduce the Reverend, and the Reverend rejects her advances, which pisses off Angel. Angel wastes no time showing us just how evil she is, as in the very next scene at the funeral for Mark, she shows up late with her father, stares intensely at Reverend Fallowfield before turning her attention on Kathy, who reacts with a sudden pain in her side, much like what Mark had been complaining about on the day of his death. Immediately after the ceremony, Angel's father goes up to Squire Middleton, who, in case you forgot, is sort of like the mayor of the village, and accuses Reverend Fallowfield of having attacked and forced himself upon Angel the previous night. Angel also makes sure to imply that the Reverend was the one who murdered Mark. Thankfully, now we all get a little break from the heavy subject matter. Kathy, her mother, and Ralph Gower are walking home through the woods together. Kathy is still feeling that pain in her side, but Ralph comforts her, and Kathy has the most adorable reaction to Ralph calling her my love.
Did you see, Ma? Not everyone calls my love like that, is it?
Wendy Padbury does a great job as Kathy, bringing this wide-eyed innocence to the character that has me rooting for her every time I rewatch the movie. She had appeared in mostly minor roles in TV series and made-for-TV movies before Blood on Satan's Claw, but her biggest role had been as the character Zoe on Doctor Who, which she first began performing in 1968 during the series' 5th season. She would continue appearing as the character in 49 episodes between 1968 and 1983, and this seems to have been the most significant role of her career, as most of her latest roles on her IMDb page seem to be reprising her role as Zoe for several different Doctor Who podcasts. Presumably, a few days later, Kathy is gathering wildflowers in a field, while two boys from Angel's cult are spying on her from some bushes. The boys come out and start talking to Kathy, who tells them that she's looking for flowers for her brother's grave, at which point the red-haired boy says that he's seen some much larger flowers nearby. Now, if you know me, then you know that I have amassed a large collection of useless trivia knowledge about horror and exploitation films from the 70s and 80s. The first time I watched Blood on Satan's Claw, I was thinking to myself, that red-haired boy looks really familiar from somewhere. So I looked it up on IMDb and discovered two things. First, this character is literally credited in the movie as red-haired coven member. Secondly, this actor, whose name is Dennis Gilmore by the way, also appeared in a 1973 supernatural biker flick called Psychomania, or also called The Death Wheelers, in which he plays a member of a biker gang who decide that they can harass people more effectively if they become undead zombies. I'm not kidding, this is the plot of the film, you can look it up. Or alternatively, you could just wait for me to make a video about it, because I probably will at some point. Kathy goes with the two boys a ways, the three of them even running and jumping just to remind you that they are indeed children. If you haven't caught on yet, much of the horror in this movie comes from the corruption of innocence on display with the village children. It was one of the things that stuck out to actress Wendy Padbury when she first read the script. She immediately noticed that this was a very different kind of horror to what she and the rest of the English public were used to, having grown accustomed to the abundance of gothic horror films being produced by Hammer Films. Blood on Satan's Claw is not a story about extraordinary people going on an adventure to battle the forces of evil. Instead, this is a story about ordinary people and ordinary children just trying to get by in an unforgiving and sometimes terrifying world. As soon as Kathy questions where they're leading her, the boys tackle her to the ground and tie her up with a rope. The game has changed. Now, instead of leading her to find flowers, the boys say that they are pretending to be cannibals and she is their captive. As they lead her into a clearing, she is suddenly surrounded by other children, and Angel Blake herself steps out from behind a tree with some serious eyebrows. Wow. There's also these two random old people that are following the group, though they're clearly part of the coven that Angel has been creating. Meanwhile, there are two scenes that are happening at the same time as Kathy's abduction. Reverend Fallowfield gets arrested for the alleged attack on Angel Blake and murder of Mark Vespers, and Ralph Gower begins searching for Kathy, having heard her initial screams when the two boys tied her up with the rope. As Angel leads Kathy into the ruins of the abandoned church that she's set up as her headquarters, we can see that they've all gone full cult mode, complete with weird chanting and, oh, look! They've even got a sleepy little demon sitting in the corner. How cute. One of the girls begins reading a prayer to the demon Behemoth from a little pocket-sized satanic Bible for all of your Satan-worshipping needs on the go. And if you listen to what exactly she's saying, you can start to piece together what the actual goals of this cult are. They are in the process of giving their sleepy demon friend power and energy by sacrificing blood and flesh to it, much in the same way that Frank from Hellraiser is able to regenerate his body by killing and consuming the men that Julia brings to him. You know, this is the second time I brought up Hellraiser in one of my videos. I should probably make a video about that film soon. We see some shots of coven members with missing limbs and bandages, implying that they've been making blood sacrifices to the demon, but as we soon shall see, the main sacrifices are a bit larger. Kathy grabs her side where she's been feeling that strange pain, and Angel notices. The demon wheezes out the words, "My skin." And Angel cuts open Kathy's dress, revealing that the spot where she's been feeling the pain has now grown a patch of very animal-like looking fur. At the very beginning of this video, I briefly mentioned that the original title of this movie was Satan's Skin, and this is where that title comes from. When the demon said, "my skin," it was being very literal. Angel has evidently worked up some kind of ritual that causes all of the village children to start growing patches of the demon's skin on their own bodies, which then gets cut off and given to the demon to help it regenerate. And that is really gross. And even more gross, now we get to the most controversial scene in the movie, as one of the boys steps forwards, takes off his clothes, and forces himself on poor Kathy Vespers. At least there's less nudity than with the earlier Angel scene, but it still leaves a really nasty taste in my mouth. In an interview with actress Wendy Padbury, she says that this scene was not in the original shooting script, but was something that director Piers Haggard came up with because he wanted the scene to be even more shocking. He apparently took Wendy Padbury out into a field during a lunch break to discuss the changes to the script with her, which left the actress feeling pressured to do the scene without having enough time to think it over and decide for herself whether she wanted to go through with it. Something that's even more disturbing to me is that apparently the camera operator during this scene tried to comfort the actress afterwards, telling her that they'd gone too far with the scene and that there was no way that the Board of Film Censors would allow it into the final movie. And he was right. The version of this scene that is in the final movie that you can watch is apparently a significantly cut down version of what they originally shot. As it stands, this final version is already an extremely uncomfortable watch, and if Piers Haggard was still alive today, all I'd have to ask him is, what the fuck, man? The sequence ends with Angel repeatedly plunging a pair of shears into Kathy's back. And Ralph Gower finally makes it to the abandoned church only after everyone else has already left. There he finds Kathy's bloodied and partially naked corpse laid out on the floor. Back in the town, the frustratingly ineffectual Squire Middleton and his men have brought the Reverend Fallowfield to the woodshed where Mark's body was found, and there he is attempting to force the Reverend to confess to Mark's murder. But just then, Ralph Gower arrives carrying Kathy's corpse in his arms, and he tells them all that Angel Blake is the real murderer, and he even has witnesses to prove it. Without so much as a sorry, the Squire orders his men to release Reverend Fallowfield and then tells them that they must quickly prepare to attack Angel and her coven. Peter, the young landowner who'd lost both his betrothed and his hand at the beginning of this movie, decides that now is the time for him to become relevant to the plot again. Having seen Kathy's body and heard what Ralph had to say, he immediately saddles up a horse and rides out to find the only man that can help them now, the judge.
Here comes the judge! Here comes the judge!
Things are starting to ramp up quite a bit though back in town. We see the girl who'd been reading the satanic prayer at Kathy's murder is now being chased through the woods by several men. They corner her by a river and throw her in to determine if she's a witch, which unfortunately was a real test that was used to determine the guilt of accused witches in real life. If the accused floated, then they were guilty of witchcraft. If they sank and drowned, then they were innocent of witchcraft, but still dead. It was really a lose-lose situation. In this case, the girl sinks immediately and doesn't come back up, but luckily, Ralph Gower was chopping wood nearby and heard the commotion and dives in to rescue the half-drowned girl. Maybe it goes without saying, but Ralph is probably one of the best characters in this movie. Just a really nice guy. He carries the girl all the way back to the house of Kathy and Mark's mother, who immediately takes the strange girl in to warm her up by the fire, even remarking that she'd thought for a moment that Ralph was bringing her Kathy back to her. It's a warm and tender moment as the two of them work to help this complete stranger. The childless mother even going as far as to have Ralph bring Kathy's old bed by the fire for the unconscious girl. However, as they begin drying the girl off, they notice a strange patch of animal-like fur growing on her leg. Ralph immediately recognizes it, calling it the devil's skin. I'm not sure where he would have recognized it from, perhaps on Kathy's body after she'd been murdered, but I think the coven was removing the skin from their victims to give to the demon, so I don't know why they would have left it on Kathy's body after killing her. Either way, they immediately summon the doctor, who is terrified when he sees the skin and refuses to treat the girl, saying that they should either let her die or take her to the town jail. They eventually manage to talk the doctor into removing the patch of skin from the girl's leg, against his better judgment. They tie the girl down, and the doctor carefully removes the patch of furry skin with a scalpel. The special effects are pretty gross, and I appreciate the challenge of having to create a prosthetic that is intended to be removed from the actor's body on camera like this. The skin is successfully removed, and they remark on the strange lack of blood. Ralph tells the doctor that they need to burn the skin to properly destroy it, but the doctor just places it into a jar to examine later. This doctor is wild, y'all. The girl eventually wakes up and tells Ralph and Kathy's mother that her name is Margaret, but she's also saying some slightly concerning things like, "I am the devil's child," and "Thou stole my master's skin, thou shalt pay with thine."
Thou stole my master's skin. Thou shalt pay with thine.
So you could say she's being a bit of a handful. Sure enough, as soon as she's able to walk again, Margaret runs off into the forest to rejoin Angel and her coven. But with impeccable timing, Peter has returned home with the judge, who has brought an entire host of tools and men to help him do battle with the devil. The townsfolk quickly bring the judge up to speed on everything that's happened since he's been gone, and the doctor provides him with the sample of devil's skin that they just removed from Margaret's leg, which the judge just sticks right up in his nostrils for some reason.
This will be sufficient.
He releases several hunting dogs to track down Margaret and hopefully lead them to the coven. Margaret manages to find Angel in the woods, but she gets her leg caught in a bear trap. Angel accuses Margaret of leading the dogs to find her, and when she sees that Margaret's patch of devil skin has been removed, she abandons her. The judge and his men catch up to Margaret and bring her back to the town, where he interrogates her in an old barn house. Here, Margaret reveals to them that Angel will be meeting with her coven that night in the old abandoned church to perform a ritual which will give their demon friend his true form. Ralph, meanwhile, has been cutting weeds outside when he accidentally hits his leg with the scythe. When he stops to examine his injury, he notices that on his own ankle is now growing a patch of devil skin. Ralph rushes to find the only person that he can trust right now, Kathy's mom, who is currently performing her duties as maid in Peter's family's house. We actually did see her several times in the house acting as maid, and she did have a very close relationship with Mistress Banham before her disappearance, but I just forgot to mention it because there's a lot of stuff going on in this movie, okay? Kathy's mother tells Ralph that the judge is currently rounding up all of the able-bodied men to prepare for a raid on the coven. Ralph swears the woman to secrecy and then reveals his demonic finding on his ankle. Kathy's mother agrees not to share Ralph's location with anyone, and Ralph rushes upstairs to hide in the attic room, the very same room where all of this started. The judge meets with all of the village men in the square in front of the church, where he gives them a pep talk before they all head out to kill some gosh darn witches. Ralph watches the eerie sight of the procession as they walk through the field with their torches and pitchforks in a shot that, again, seems like it would be straight out of a heavy metal band's music video. Ralph settles into the unused room, but he begins hearing a pounding noise coming from the other side of the room. We don't see what's creating the noise, but Ralph sure seems terrified of it. The villagers converge outside the abandoned church, where the satanic ritual is already in progress. Ralph has been supernaturally transported to the church, where he now stands in a daze in front of Angel Blake while a demonic voice rasps from just off screen. Y'all, I'm sorry I keep bringing it back to heavy metal, but I listen to a lot of heavy music, and this imagery has absolutely influenced and inspired a ton of bands over the years. We see that Angel's coven has grown quite a bit, with a lot more random adults we've never seen before. I do wonder where these people came from, if they're supposed to be from the same village as our main characters, or if they're maybe from other nearby villages. Like, what exactly did the recruitment process look like? Were they all afflicted with the devil skin first and then brought into the coven? Or did they only grow the devil skin after they joined the coven and pledged themselves to Satan? I need a breakdown of the satanic bureaucracy, damn it! The ritual continues with a bunch of people playing musical instruments in a demonic cacophony, and a young woman gets completely naked and then hands Ralph a ceremonial knife, I'm assuming for him to use to cut off his devil skin to give to the demon. Angel cuddles up with the demon, which I wish we saw a bit more of in the movie, because the creature design with the animal fur and all the horns sticking out of its face in odd places is very interesting. It feels very inspired by more classical depictions of demons and the devil as being these goat-human hybrids, which itself came from the ancient Greek mythological creature, the satyr. Finally, having enough of watching, the judge jumps up into a window and unwraps the long, oddly shaped package we've seen his servant carrying for him. It is a greatsword, in the shape of a cross, naturally. And now, this is where the movie gets just a little bit too stupid and cheesy for me. Angel Blake looks up, sees the judge, screams in terror, and then just runs directly into a pitchfork one of the villagers is carrying and dies. A bit of an underwhelming end to an otherwise extremely interesting and at times downright terrifying villain character. Next, the judge jumps down and, in slow motion, waves his sword around a bit to scare away the coven members. Still in slow motion, the demon starts doing a little dance in front of the judge, because what else would you call this weird little hopping thing he's doing? Come on, that's just silly. The judge makes a very serious face, then just stabs the demon in the stomach, lifts it up, and throws it into the fire, which kills it. I guess that's all it takes to defeat the forces of evil. Short, angry man with big sword. The coven looks on in horror as their demon lord burns to death. Ralph has been freed from the spell over him and looks down to see that the devil's skin is no longer growing on his leg, and the movie ends on a freeze frame of the judge gazing into the fire. So, not the best ending, but I think that's just a consequence of the kind of story the filmmakers set out to tell. Blood on Satan's Claw deliberately set up its main conflict as being between paganism and rationalism, but ends the movie with a sort of literal deus ex machina when the judge abandons rationality in favor of the tools of Christianity. The conflict literally brought to an end with the demon impaled on the end of a cross. This is why I think the ending doesn't work. To bring back some of what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, the film started off as a folk horror movie, but ended as a gothic horror movie. My next two videos will be taking a close look at Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man, respectively, and I think both of these are much more effective than Blood on Satan's Claw because of their unwillingness to give in to the temptation of providing a clean ending, thereby leaving the question of rationality versus paganism unanswered. I like this because I personally think there is no clean answer to this question, and I also think leaving the ending unresolved just makes for a more effective horror movie. Well, I think this video has gone on for long enough. I hope you all enjoyed part 1 of my video series on folk horror, and that you stick around for parts 2 and 3, in which I'll be going even more in depth on historical context and the general philosophy behind these stories. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This is a very exciting year for me since I am finally going to start covering some movies and genres that I am extremely obsessed with to an unhealthy degree, and I can't wait to take you, my viewers, on this journey with me. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you want to keep seeing my videos, and as always, stay weird.